Ancient Greece is considered by most as the home of democracy. A thriving, forward-thinking civilization, they were also on the forefront of literature and other academic pursuits. But, unlike other areas of the world around this time, Greece was founded on one of the most heinous practices in human history: slavery. And thanks to their methodical bookkeeping and literary resources, we actually know quite a lot about how slaves were treated during these times. Of course, these resources come from the masters, quite often omitting how the slaves themselves felt about being held captive. So how are these men, women, and children actually treated? Let's find out. Quite incredibly, slave masters and family members often grew up forming something of a friendship with their slaves. And because of this, there was a wide spectrum of how slaves were treated. Loose estimates suggest that at its height, 1 in 4 people in ancient Greece were slaves. But that number could be far higher, which would be quite the figure. People like Aristotle, widely considered to be one of the greatest thinkers of the day, hardly helped with the practice of slavery. He himself classifying slaves into 2 categories. One, he claimed, were natural-born slaves, those who had been born into captivity, and the other were products of misfortune, captured in battle or otherwise kidnapped and forced into slavery. As you're probably well aware, nobody wants to be forced into doing anything, let alone backbreaking work for most of the day. And before we romanticize the notion in any way, we should point out for that the large part, slavery in ancient Greece was not something which was desired in any way. There was, however, something of a hierarchical structure where slavery was concerned. At the bottom of the pile were war slaves, those who had been captured in battle. These were the people who were often treated the worst, as they had actively fought against the state. You wouldn't have found many people in ancient Greece advocating for leniency on behalf of these guys. Not at all. Next, you had slaves who were forced into agriculture and mining and other dangerous, labor-intensive jobs. Due to the nature of their work, mining and agriculture slaves had a relatively short lifespan. Depending on your position in society and your circumstances before becoming a slave, there were more bearable roles available in Greek society. If you happen to be a skilled worker, a carpenter, doctor, or academic, for example, you might be given work suitable to your position and skill set. These slaves were relatively high up in the hierarchy and would generally receive more favorable conditions. Undeniably, though, the top jobs when it came to slavery during this period were to either be a domestic slave or a public slave. Domestic slaves did all the necessary tasks needed to run and maintain a household, such as cooking, cleaning, and possibly even childcare. This meant they often formed closer relationships with their masters, with some even receiving relatively fair treatment. Public slaves were given roles in the public sector and often managed public buildings, oversaw construction projects, and might have even been given positions of authority within the legal system, which is quite incredible. These slaves were sometimes even able to buy their freedom if they had acquitted themselves particularly well during their service, which at least gave them the idea of having a goal in mind, or something to work towards. Of course, treatment of these groups varied vastly and was often down to the master they were serving. In general, though, we know that life as a slave in the ancient world, not just Greece, was pretty grim. Slaves were regularly subjected to physical abuse, sometimes even daily. This was often used as a deterrent method aimed at the whole group, not just the individual. Slave owners would often make an example of a slave who had maybe acted or spoken out of turn, in the hope that his or her peers would think twice before mimicking their behavior. Beatings and floggings were fairly common, and in general, these forms of punishment were usually enough to keep the slave population subdued. Should slaves have been deemed to have committed a slightly more serious act, then the punishment would usually increase in severity also. It wasn't uncommon for masters to torture their slaves, and the reason for this could come from any variety of sources. As you could probably imagine, most slaves dreamt of freedom, and there were endless plots of revolt and rebellion during this period. Sadly, with a serious lack of clear communication methods needed to organize, these uprisings were often put down in their infancy. As a result, those who were found to be behind the plot could expect to be tortured, often to death, until their slave master was satisfied they had given up everyone involved in the plan. Sexual abuse was also rife between slave master and their property. During its height, between 500 and 300 BC, values and morals were a little different than they are today, and slave masters would think nothing of using one of his slaves for his own pleasure. Oftentimes, this would happen when a slave had done nothing wrong. Obviously, female slaves were the most common target of slave owners, but not exclusively. Ancient Greece as a society was famously indifferent towards same-sex relationships, so male slaves could often be just as vulnerable as females when it came to the sexual whims of their owners. Which brings us on to our next point. Should a slave in ancient Greece find themselves in need of medical attention, then these problems were rarely dealt with. As previously mentioned, abuse was rife, so slaves would often be in need of medical attention as a result of various dealings with their owners, whether that be due to beatings, torture, or sexual assault. Sadly, these needs were often neglected as masters simply did not see the need to burden themselves with the hassle of arranging for a doctor to visit. Oftentimes, if a slave owner was wealthy enough to keep slaves, he was wealthy enough to replace them if and when they died. All of this led to a very serious but criminally overlooked problem amongst slaves during this period: their psychological welfare. Only now were we really beginning to understand just how important mental health is. So the idea that slave owners 2,500 years ago were concerned with the mental health of their slaves is, quite simply, a foreign concept. Slave owners certainly knew all about the ways in which psychological abuse could benefit them, and would often use cruel tactics to manipulate and control their slaves. If a person had mentally trained themselves to become unresponsive to physical abuse, as could sometimes happen, they might be subject to something much more personal: psychological abuse. This could mean threats of violence against family members or close friends, or long periods of isolation from loved ones. Of course, for a slave who has been brought up on and is possibly numb to violence, this could be a much more effective tool. Another unspeakable way in which slaves were treated in ancient Greece was the way in which they were housed. Now, with no plumbing to speak of, there were very few living in ultimate luxury, but slaves had it worse than anyone, without a doubt. They were often thrown together in seriously overcrowded living facilities, with little to no access to sanitation or basic necessities. As you can imagine, in a Mediterranean climate, these conditions were often a breeding ground for disease. Once there was an outbreak of one of the many diseases which threatened the people of the time, such as tuberculosis, leprosy, measles, or smallpox, then everybody was at risk. Sadly, the practice of slavery was an important part of life in ancient Greece. But it wouldn't last forever. Important historical events such as the Roman conquest meant that Greece would soon adopt Rome's legal system and societal norms. This did not mean a blanket ban on slavery, but it did mean the practice at least wasn't as widespread. As labor practices evolved, so too did slavery in the traditional sense, and ideas such as serfdom were born. With the introduction of Christianity and the idea that all men were equal before God, another hammer blow was dealt to slavery and its abhorrent practices. Legal reforms in the 6th century also brought to address the plight of slaves, but it wouldn't be until 1828 that the practice was finally completely abolished. Nowadays, slavery is completely outlawed in the developed world, and rightly so. Unfortunately, though, there are still pockets of the Third World where the practice continues, so we still have a ways to go yet. Thanks for watching today, and why not subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more insightful videos in the future. Bye, guys!